A very good afternoon to everyone and welcome to the webinar today. I would like to start by extending a warm welcome to Ms. Vinita Krishnan. Ma'am is currently working as a senior R&D software engineer in Broadcom's Payment Security Division in Bangalore. The division is a team of fintech experts who build software that allow the world's largest banks and merchants to drive down payment fraud using advanced risk-based authentication and data analytics. She completed her formal education from Hyderabad and went on to earn her BE honors degree in computer science from BITS Pilani. She has gained an immense experience working at corporations like CARE, Healthcare Tech, Texas Instruments, and Broadcom. She is extremely passionate about mentoring and leadership and is an international Toastmasters certified communicator and leader. She's also been an active participant in Women in Technology and Women Connect events across India, where she helped guide young girls and aspiring women into diverse career paths in STEM. Ma'am, we are honored to have you here today. Thank you so much for your presence. We would now like to begin by handing over the stage to you so that we can begin with our presentation for today.
Thank you, Ishita. Good evening to all. It's really an honor for me to meet and interact with all of you today. A lot of students, a lot of teachers, mentors, collaborators. I'm sure all of you are going through a very unique situation right now in this pandemic, and I hope all of you are doing well and staying healthy. I would like to thank the IRIS team for giving me this opportunity as well. I'm happy to be associated with IRIS for today's seminar. I'm going ahead and starting my presentation. So today I'll be talking about the category which, one of the categories which you have for our IRIS projects, which is system software. Let me just make the screen. Is my screen visible, Ishita?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, sure. So today we'll be talking about the category systems software. So let me quickly walk you through the agenda that we have planned for today. I'll start with briefing you a bit about the category. What exactly does the category contain? What are the topics that you can probably think about in researching and exploring under this category? There are a lot of subcategories in this, so I'll be walking you through each subcategory. So my aim is basically to help you understand what the subcategory is about. I'll give you a brief about that category and then maybe explore about what are the possible areas of research or what are the upcoming areas that require more research in those areas. So we will then be moving on to developing a project. I'll be giving you a walkthrough of how you can, go about developing a project. And of course, we'll move on to the ethical considerations part. Whenever you're doing a project, what are the ethical things that you need to keep in mind? And we can end with a Q&A session. So these are the things that I have in my agenda for today's session. Again, the intent is to make you familiarized with a lot of the content. So some of you may be aware of it. Some of you may have already, done some amount of research. But if you're not aware of it, it's perfectly fine. I'll start from a basic level, and you can, some of the words that you don't understand, you can go back and look it up, and hopefully that will motivate or encourage you to, learn more about it. So that is my intent for today. So we can get started with system software. So system software is, if you think about it, it is here you can study about the development of software, what are the information processes, what are the methodologies to demonstrate, analyze, or control any process or any solution. If you take any software system, if you take a computer reservation system, you can have a banking system, or you can have any content management systems, a database management system, right? So you have a lot of control systems around us. You have a lot of software systems around us that are built on technology. Each of these contains an architecture, it contains a database, it contains a network layer, it contains an application layer. So there are multiple layers on which each of these systems are built. So this system software is not just the study of the software component of it, but it is what are the major components that are there inside and how they interact with each other. Maybe at the architecture level, maybe at the different layers. If you want to go into each layer, you can probably, go in depth into each layer. So this is the broad category what system software contains about. The subcategories that we have for IRIS are, as listed on the screen, you have algorithms. Algorithms, as many of you might be aware, it is just a step-by-step procedure of calculations that you tell a computer or you tell a machine to complete a specific task. The second category is cybersecurity. This is more closer to my heart because this is the field in which I'm working in currently. I'm working in a subdivision of this, which is payment security. Cybersecurity is most essential in today's world because we need protection of a lot of systems. We need protection of the hardware, of the software, of the network, of data, and we need to protect it against unauthorized attacks. We need to make sure that somebody with a malicious intent or somebody who's not authorized to access or gain control over these systems should not be taking control over them. So this is the second category. And the third category we have is databases. So I think there's a saying, in God we trust, the rest need to bring data. So this means anything without facts, anything that is not recorded, anything which does not have data to prove itself is a bit difficult to stand some ground. So we need to have proper data creation, proper organization. We need to have proper access management for that data. And how are we using this information? How are we using the data available to us to make, make better decisions, make better patterns, make better analytics? This is what we're going to study in this subcategory. And the fourth is a very interesting category. It is a human machine interface. So people who are students who are interested in UI, UX, user interfaces or user design will find this very interesting because this category basically talks about a user interface or a dashboard that will connect a person to a machine. So you might be having a smart phone with a touch screen, or you might be having a fitness gadget which shows you how many steps you have done in a day, or your pulse. So it gives you a screen with all those details. Or it might be something as simple as a thermostat in your house where you're checking the temperature and then you're trying to make out if it's good for you or you want to reduce it. So these are the various things that you can do with a human and a machine interface. And the fifth category is languages and operating systems. So this basically contains a set of instructions that, a machine, when you're translating it from a higher level language to a lower level language, which is a machine level language that a computer can understand and which it can execute. So you can learn about semantics of a language, you can learn about construction of a language, or you could probably develop your own you can develop your own kernel for an operating system. How does an operating system work? So these are the things that you can learn about in this category. And I think the sixth category is also something that many of you will find interesting because it is about mobile applications. A lot of you might be using. We have a lot of applications for messaging. Any task that you want done today will most probably have an application. So this is basically a software application developed specifically for use on a wireless system. Like it could be for a mobile device, it could be for a tablet, or it could be for a watch or any other system. So this is what we will be studying. How do we build that capability, build that feature into a mobile app, and what are the things that we need to keep in mind when you're developing something like that. And the last category is I think this is something that is very ironical today because it is about online learning. It's about e-learning systems and how we can utilize electronic means, electronic techniques to make education more accessible to all, and how we can move further away from our traditional means. And it's not only about moving away, but making it more accessible to all and trying to help more students or more people gain access to that knowledge. So these are the categories that I will be talking about today. So the first subcategory that we have is algorithms. So basically an algorithm is a finite sequence of well-defined instructions that can achieve a specific task. So for example, if you want to go from your house to a particular destination, so you say go straight, go left, and then stop at the lamp post or something like that. So this is a finite sequence. It is a finite set of instructions for you to achieve a specific task. Because when you're talking to a machine, when you're talking to a computer or a device, you need to understand that it works on logic. It works on a step-by-step instruction. It has to have a set of rules or instructions that it can follow at each step in order for it to execute it and for it to get the expected results. If you want to understand more about how this is achieved, you can take about different categories of algorithms. How are they categorized? If you take by means of implementation, we have iterative or recursive algorithms, and we have serial or parallel and distributed algorithms. So if you take, for example, let us take a simple problem of finding the kth even number. So if I say the first even number is 0, so the second even number is 2. So if I want to find the kth even number, so this is a simple algorithm because it is how you find it is basically the number into k minus 1. So this, if you see this algorithm on the left hand side, you're giving an input of I and you're giving an even number, and you're going it a step-by-step process where you're doing a while loop, and for every input number you're giving a check and you're returning the even number. Whereas if you see on the right hand side, you have a recursive algorithm where if k is 1, then you're returning 0, else return even of k minus 1 plus 2. So if you take, for example, you want to find the first, you want to find the second even number. So k is equal to 2 here. So 2 minus 1. You will be recursively calling it until you find that specific even number. So this is how this particular algorithm will work. You also have serial or parallel distributed algorithms where for a serial algorithm, one instruction is executed at a particular time. But if you have a parallel or a distributed algorithm, you can have multiple computer in use, and you can have multiple threads running, or you can have multiple subcomponents running, and you can divide the problem into more symmetrical or asymmetrical subproblems, and you can collect the results back. So one problem in the serial or parallel distributed approach is that you will have to also add the additional overhead of the communication of back of the results. So it is not only the calculation part. If you see these algorithms that we have talked about for finding the positive integer or the kth even number and all, so this will have a specific time of execution. It will have a specific space complexity that you need to calculate. But in your serial or when you're talking about parallel distributed algorithm, it is not just the space-time complexity, it is also the additional communication head that needs to be calculated. We can also categorize algorithms in other ways. It can be based on the design of what is the approach that you're taking to build that algorithm. For example, you can go for a brute force or an exhaustive search. This is basically, you go, it's a very naive method of calculation where you go step by step. So if you have a set of 10 numbers and I want to find what are all the even numbers in a set of 10 numbers. So I start with 1, it's not an even number. I start with 2, okay, it's an even number. So I go on. So this is a exhaustive search. If I can divide and conquer. So the second method is I split it into 2, the first 5 and the second 5. Then you're dividing it into smaller problems and you're trying to divide and conquer each sub problem. The third category is where you have search and enumeration, where you can do a graph, or, this is basically, implemented in most of our social networks, our traffic decongestion systems, or your live map algorithms. So this is where most of your search and enumeration algorithms are used. And one more way of defining an algorithm could be, is it deterministic or non-deterministic? So deterministic means there is a specified output at each level. So for example, you are going from your home to a particular destination. So you want to go right and then you want to go left. So at each point, you know that there is a specified output that either you turn left or you turn right. But if it is a non-deterministic model, for example, when you're dealing with a financial transaction or you're dealing with some other kind of an e-commerce website, it is possible that you do not know what is the next output or what could be the next action. So you do not know the computer or the algorithm next step may not be fine. It may not be determined. In that case, you'll have to go based on heuristics, which is past data. So based on the past data, the algorithm will decide what to do next. It can be called as a guess, but it is a calculated guess. It is it is quite accurate based on the past data that it has. And this is called as heuristics, and we use it quite common in our databases topic as well. If you want to go about what are the characteristics of an algorithm, and if you're writing an algorithm, you should know that an algorithm should be having well-defined inputs. It should have well-defined outputs. It should be clear. You have to know what you're doing, what is the output that you're getting, what is the path that you're following. And as you might be knowing, an algorithm is only a logical explanation of the steps. It can be implemented on any language, on any programming language you want. And your logic is independent of the language that you're going to be coding it in. It is obviously a finite set of instructions, and it should be a feasible solution. I wanted to talk about algorithmic efficiency because when you're writing an algorithm, you have to try to write it in the most optimum possible way. So each problem may have n number of solutions, but what is the most optimum solution? If you can try to find out that optimum solution, so that would be that would save a lot of your resources. It would save your complexity in terms of space and time. So that is what we should try to achieve. We should try to achieve an algorithmic efficiency that is best possible. We have something called as a big O notation, where each algorithm that you write, you can find out what is the algorithmic efficiency using this notation, and it's a function of the input. So if you have of the input n, so you have different big O notations like O of n, O of log n, O of n square. So these denote nothing but what is the algorithmic efficiency. When you're talking about doing a project in algorithms, so you can do a comparative study. You can, so these are just some suggestions that I had on the top of my mind. You could probably, come up with a very different idea. So some of the ideas that I had was, if you can take up a problem and you can, if you're solving it in first algorithm A and you're doing it in algorithm B, so what is the comparative study of it? Are you saving some time? Are you saving some complexity in terms of time and space by following a different path? You can come up with, increasing efficiency of that. And you can also come up with implementation of algorithms to create an application or a module. So if you're looking at a problem around you, so if you're looking at, developing an app, for example, for transport, for easier transport, and you're trying to build an algorithm for that. So you can try to create your own algorithm, you create your own steps on how you can go about and build that. You can also talk about, you can also research more about, graph-based algorithms, which are most commonly used now in social networks, in navigation systems. So this is a very interesting field of research now. So Rajeshri Basu from our IRIS 2019-2020 fair had, done a project on graphs related algorithms, and so he was one of the winners last year. So you can do a lot of theoretical research, and you can try to find practical problems in which you can implement that algorithm. A lot of things are available for you to go through in these areas. The categories that I have mentioned, you can pick up any category and try to find an algorithm algorithm type that is used in that category and try to implement a different variety of it. So these are the ideas that I had in this category. So we'll move on to the second one, which is cybersecurity. So cybersecurity basically talks about protection of any system, any data, any network, any information you have, and you need to protect it from unauthorized access. So somebody that you do not want accessing that data, you do not want using that application, or you feel has a malicious intent towards using that. So these are the things that we need to look into when we are developing a software system. We need to make sure first that it is secure. The different types of when you talk of cyber security, so you have to talk about what are you securing it against, right? So you need to know what is the problem for you to secure something. So there are different types of cyber threats, cyber attacks that happen, and the problem that arises from a cybersecurity attack is that it could result in monetary loss. It could result in identity theft, extortion attempts. A lot of your important data could be lost. So for example, if your Gmail account is hacked, you could lose your emails, you could lose your photos, you could lose your synced contacts. And it gives access to it gives a third person an access to personal information, like it could be a medical or financial records, a lot of, as I said, multimedia, which could be misused. So these are, to avoid these things is why we need a secure software system and why we need cybersecurity. When you talk about the types of cybersecurity threats, so there are many threats, many attacks, different types of attacks that can happen. I'll be talking about a few. So the most common one which happens is, of course, phishing. So phishing is basically sending fraudulent emails by, probably changing the email address a bit, or, changing the name on that email address a bit, and it'll make it look very genuine, but it is actually an imposter. So it makes the email look like it is from a reliable source, but it is not. So the aim for somebody to be doing this is that that email might contain a link, or it could contain some malicious content, or it could contain a software that gets automatically downloaded on your device. And the aim is basically to steal any sensitive information from you, any sensitive data from you, like your bank details, your financial details, any login information, or it could also be to gain total control and access over your account. So this is what phishing is about. We can then talk about malware. So this is a type of software that is designed to gain unauthorized access to cause damage to a device or a computer. You have a more, different variety of it called as ransomware, where people try to, extort money from you by demanding a ransom, and only then you can regain access to it. So for example, if you're running a business on a social networking site, and you have lost control of your social account, and somebody else is running it, and somebody else is posting content on it, and they might demand a ransom from you, saying that if you want to regain account back, this is the ransom that I'm expecting. So this is the kind of a threat that we have from malware or ransomware. There are other different types like data leakage, lack of security, and hacking. So data leakage is nothing but unauthorized transmission of data from an individual or organization to an external recipient. So it could be if your data is not secured, you do not have proper firewalls in place, or you do not have proper firewalls for your networks, and somebody outside of your network is able to access that data, is able to access information that is supposed to be accessible only to you. So this is how data leakage happens. So again, there's a lack of security, like not having strong passwords, not having protocols in place, not having proper firewalls that secure the system. These all lead to a lack of security. Hacking is another very common type of an attack that happens. So this is where the security defenses of the software system are breached, and they exploit the weaknesses that are there in it to gain access. So if I can talk about an example in payment security. So what we do is, if you're checking out something on on Amazon or Flipkart or any of your e-commerce websites. And so you have to enter an OTP, or you have to enter your CVV or card details for you to complete the transaction, to let the payment processing get finished. But what if you could bypass that, right? What if you could bypass entering the OTP? What if you could directly complete the transaction without entering any of that authentication information? So this is what a hacker tries to do. So he will try to bypass that by finding out some vulnerability in that software and then trying to get through it. So we need to implement measures to ensure that doesn't happen. The very interesting, this is a very recent kind of an attack that has happened, so I wanted to discuss it with you, which is social engineering. And this is a tactic that people use to trick you into revealing your sensitive information. So as I mentioned earlier, right, so if somebody is taking an access, taking over your Twitter account or your social media account, it could also be something as simple as somebody calling you saying, I'm from the bank, and that your account is going to be locked if you don't transfer so and so money, or if you don't give me this OTP. Could be something as simple as that. So trying to create a pressurized environment, trying to put social pressure on someone to reveal sensitive data. And it can be combined with any of the earlier threats that we have mentioned as well, like clicking on malicious links or downloading malware or trusting a malicious source. So these are all different types of threats that we have and that we are currently dealing with in the cybersecurity. For you to research or for you to do a project on this, you can first of all start with analyzing what are the vulnerabilities or weaknesses of a system. You can pick up a software system, or you can pick up a hardware, you can pick up a network, take an app or take a database and see how is it that you can, somebody who is not authorized, how they can exploit the weaknesses in that system. So try to analyze that, and once you get there, then the next step of the problem is how do you fix it. There's also one more, if you talk about phishing, like I spoke about phishing. So how do you identify fake identity or fake emails? So last year in IRIS 2019-2020, there were a lot of projects around fake news, identification of fake news. How do you know if a source of news is genuine? So these are some of the things that you can research upon. And of course, we talked about data privacy and security. How do you ensure that your information is safe? How do you ensure that your data is secure? So for example, if you have a financial app installed in your device, you have a banking app installed in your device, the first thing that you think about before using it is it safe? Can I install this app? Is my data secure? So if I enter my CVV or if I enter my financial login details, is it going to be automatically saved on the database of that server, or is it going to be encrypted? So these are some of the thoughts that you have when you're using an app, and it's important that you have data privacy and security. So these are some of the things that you can research upon. But I wanted to add one more point, which is it's not only important to try and prevent something from happening, you should also know what to do if a malicious attack happens. So say your account is hacked, or say a fraudulent transaction happens, or say your system has been compromised, your network has been compromised. So you need to have a system in place to retrieve it back. You need to have a mitigation strategy for you to retrieve it back, and that is something that is not researched much upon. So you can go into details on how you can handle retrieval of data, how quickly can a system go back to its previous state. So these are a few ideas I had that you can research on in cybersecurity. So we'll move on to the third subcategory, which is databases. Like I said earlier, everybody trusts authentic data, relevant data, and it's very important to have a single source of information for you to have relevant data put together, for you to have relevant patterns that are coming out of that data. And in this category, mainly you'll be studying about creation or analyzing, creation or analysis of data organization for your access management and also updating that particular database system. We have, if you look at the current scenario in the world, we are having to handle huge data sets daily. If, for example, you're using an app, or if you're using a social media, you have data from probably last 5 or 6 years. That how do you handle such a huge? How does the server handle such a huge flow of data? And there are studies which go into this line, like big data. There are also studies which go into data mining. Data mining, so when you're mining something, you're trying to find gold from dust, right? You're trying to make something, you're trying to find something useful out of a large area. So this is an area of research which is called as data mining, and it is basically discovering patterns amidst huge data. So for example, if I have a set of financial transactions in my past, this is something that we use at work. So if I have a set of financial transactions over the past 2 years of a particular user, so I can make a pattern saying, okay, this particular user has, done transactions only up to $100. So he doesn't do transactions more than $100. Or this particular user probably shops at, does online shopping a lot more. So how can I make that experience better? So how can I get patterns out of that data to organize it better, to make access easier? So you can research on these things as well. There are different data mining techniques which are used. There is clustering, there is classification. So there are different techniques that are used. So you can research more on that. So basic definitions for somebody who is not aware: if you have a database, it is a collection of latent data. If you have a database management system, it is basically a software system to facilitate creation and maintenance of a database. So every database runs on schema. A schema is nothing but you have a collection of keys, you have a collection of constraints. So for example, if you have an employee database, so your employee ID will be the primary key. It is a primary identification for that particular employee. You could have a secondary key, which is the name of the employee. So combination of these two is a unique key. So this is, so a particular database can have multiple schemas. You can have each database running on more than one schemas. And you can have a schematic diagram to represent what that particular schema contains, what are the keys that it has, and what is the flow of data within that schema, what are the tables it contains. So these are a few basic definitions that I wanted you to understand. And this is just a diagrammatic representation of a data system. If you have an application, or you have an end user who's using an application, and it internally queries the DBMS, which then tries to get access to your stored database. And in additional thing that I wanted to mention here is, if you want to have your data encrypted, there is something called as a hardware security module, HSM, and that is a physical device which is used for encrypting your database. So you can also have, if you're doing a study on cybersecurity and database system, it's good to know how exactly database is encrypted and how that data is protected. So like I said, these are some of the research topics that you can do in this particular subcategory. How can you handle data privacy? How can you handle security and access management? How can you do real-time data analytics and insights? So if you have seen the current situation in the world that we are in, right? We are in a global pandemic, and we need to know how many clusters of positive cases are there. We need to know how many people are in a critical stage, how many have mild level of infection, or how many have, are moving towards a critical stage. So only if you have that level of data, only if you have that level of analysis, you'll be able to take informed decisions to solve the crisis. So this is something that is really important in data analytics. If you might have seen our state government dashboards. You might have seen a dashboard saying these are the number of positive data, positive people who have been tested today. These are the clusters. So if you take Bangalore city, you have around say 200 wards, and among those wards, how many are red zones, how many are containment zones. So how do I classify them? How do I make clusters? How can I better segregate the data for me to make more informed decisions? So real-time data analytics is very important for us in solving any crisis, in any problem. I remember there was a project last year where somebody had done a project on corrective driving, which is a self-corrective driving. So if you're going above a particular speed, automatically the speed gets reduced based on your past driving history. If you have a history of speeding and you're trying to go above a specific speed of say 60 or 70, automatically it brings it down. So this is something that it's real time, it's getting the data, it's feeding it back to a system, and it's trying to give an output, it's trying to correct itself. So these are things, there's a lot of scope for you to research on this. There is something called as predictive modeling and pattern generation based on historical data. So like I mentioned earlier, we do a lot of data science platform development. So we do a lot of models development where we train the model to generate patterns, generate predictions based on previous data. So for example, if a financial transaction has happened for a particular user over the past 3 years, so how many of those transactions have been fraud? So is the transaction coming from a particular area? Is it above a particular amount? So these are different parameters that are collected by a data model. And there is a predictive score or a prediction that is done saying, based on my past 10 transactions, I can predict that my 11th transaction is going to be a 70% fraudulent transaction, or it could be a very less rate, or it could be a very less possibility of being a fraud, based on the input parameters of the 11th transaction. So these are some very interesting things that you can do in predictive modeling and pattern generation. And of course, there is data compression and retrieval. There was a project last year again, which is done on lossless data comparison, which talked about how, if you see, right, you have say a 1 GB file and you want to send it across to someone. So you usually use any compression software. You use say WinZip, you try to make it half its size, you try to make it within the limited whatever is allowed limit, and then you try to share it across through a server or through SFTP or through email. So how can I achieve this compression? How can I achieve data compression? And not just compression, but without losing any data and able to retrieve it easily. So these are some research topics that you can have in this particular area. So moving on to our this human-machine interface. A human-machine interface is basically a user interface or a system or a device. So we talked in the beginning about, we talked about touch screens, we talked about thermostat screens, we talked about smart watches. So these are all interfaces that you have which help you to understand data in a better way. And some of these HMIs communicate with programmable logic controllers or PLCs. And this input and output sensors get the information for us to be able to view it on the screen. So for example, if you have a pressure sensor, right? You have your, let's take a weather, right? So if you have a temperature sensor within your mobile device, so it could sense the temperature and it gives it back as a output for you on the screen. So this is how you can, this is how HMIs are integrated with PLCs for us to be able to view that information. It can also be used to track production time, trends, and tags. In industries, this is used a lot. So for example, if you take a plant today, a manufacturing plant, if you take, say, a car manufacturing plant today, In this situation that we are in today, the engineer who is on the ground will have to monitor what is the temperature in which that particular car is probably being made, or uh, what are the conditions in which it is being manufactured, what is the different parameters that they are controlling. But if you have if you have a HMI, or you have a control system that is available where you can track all these parameters, it can also be done from an offsite. So these are key performance indicators. You have KPIs, which can also be overseen through a HMI. And like I said earlier, you can monitor machine inputs and outputs, and visually display the data. So HMIs today are used very widely in the industrial processes as well, because they both digitize and centralize the data for a viewer. And it is not only, there is something also called as SCADA, HMI and SCADA. Both of these are used not only to view the data, but you can also monitor and control it. So let us take a simple example of a thermostat. So if I only view that the temperature is probably, too high for me, it's around 30 or 35, and I want to reduce it. So just viewing that information is not important for me. I need to be able to control it. So I need to give an input, and it should take the input, process it, and give me an output. So SCADA and HMI help in both monitoring, controlling these systems as well. And like I mentioned earlier, in manufacturing industries and today on the ground or even off-site, operators can see important information displayed in graphs, charts, or digital dashboards. And they can also view and manage any alarms. For example, if in a boiler, you might all have heard about a recent boiler tragedy that has happened in our country. So if a temperature is going beyond a particular, if the temperature in the boiler is going beyond a particular, permitted risk level, so there has to be alarms going on which immediately shut down all the systems. So these kind of control mechanisms are really important in our day-to-day life today. Some of the research topics for you in this field, maybe you can develop a very simple HMI for any of your purposes. Like if you want to have a HMI for just a sensor for pressure or for your temperature, so how are you going to inbuild that into visual display? Or you have a pulse. If you have a pulse, how can you record it, and how can you display it? How can you make analytics on that data? So these are different things that you can do. Somebody had done an online voting system last year, so where you have an interface for you to input your choice of the candidate, and you can see how much which candidate is standing at which position. So these are the things that you can develop using an HMI. And again, like I said earlier, sensor-based input and output. If you combine a PLC with a HMI, you can do a lot of things. So if you want to detect seismic waves much earlier, you can do an earthquake detection system. There is already a tsunami detection system in place that you have. So these are the things which are not just being able to track and monitor, but also being able to control, or being able to give out an alarm so that we can take informed decisions based on that. Another interesting category, which a lot of people are already doing, but you can research further, is smart home systems. Something in this pandemic stage could be if you are, you want the entry to your house to be restricted, or you want the temperature to be scanned before somebody is entering your house, or you want, it could also be at a workplace, or it could also be in a hospital. So there are smart systems that have come up, and say it's something as simple as, you're cooking something and you want it to automatically get switched off once it reaches a particular boiling temperature. So how can you, the smart home systems utilize HMI to a very vast extent. So you can research more on that. And something which I find very interesting is gaming and virtual reality. So with gestures, which with your physical inputs, you can make make the interface, or you can make the characters in the game move accordingly. So this is also a very hot topic for an upcoming research. A very important thing that you can think about when you're doing research on this topic is, what is the practical problem that I'm trying to solve, right? So there is a problem. When you pick up a project, there should be a problem statement that you are trying to solve. So, for example, if somebody is differently abled, and they do not have access to the information like others would have, so they can have an interface with which they can communicate. They can have an interface with which they can access data immediately, and through which they can control their surroundings. So these are already in research, but this is a very interesting thing to do, because it has a lot of practical value, and it really helps a lot of people. So these are some of the ideas I had on top of my mind in this HMI topic for you to research. So we can quickly move on to our next subcategory, which is languages and operating systems. So for people who are interested in understanding how the core of a software works, so you will find operating systems very interesting, because how does an operating system work? How does it has a kernel, or what are the software instructions involved in making an operating system? So if you can understand at the machine level, what is the machine level language, and how you can get a higher level language to be converted into a machine level language. So that would be very interesting for you to research upon. So you have languages like C, Java, which are internally converted into a machine level language for it to understand and execute a particular task. If you take operating systems, it not only performs a lot of tasks like scheduling. It does file management, it does memory management, it does process management. It does a lot of things like handling inputs, outputs, controlling of your devices. So all of these are things that an operating system manages. And if you're interested in learning more about this, how an operating system works, so you can study more on this. So this is what this subcategory contains about. It is basically, involves studies that involve development or analysis of artificial languages used to write instructions that can be translated into machine level assembly language, which can later be executed or understood by the computer. Again, a few research topics in this area would be trying to optimize the resources, right? So whenever you're performing a task, whenever you're physically performing a task, you want to do it in the way in which it consumes the least effort, in which it consumes your least time, and least number of resources. So similarly, when you have an operating system, you should try to optimize the way in which maybe scheduling happens, probably distribution of tasks happens. So how does it control the distribution of tasks? So we have a lot of scope for research in this area. So distributed operating systems is something that real-time applications and users have a lot of benefit to gain from. So this is an area that you can research upon. If you talk about languages, again, you can do regular expression search on social media, or if you have a brand, right? You have say an IPL, which is a brand now in sports for events. So what is this particular brand doing in what are the discussions surrounding this brand in social media? So you can do a regular expression search. So a lot of analytics happens if you see roles and companies, right? There would be something like a social media analyst. So what does this analyst do? He tries to get the reputation of the brand. What is the image of the brand among social networks? So this is what that particular role does. So they try to basically do a language or an expression search and try to find out what are the discussions happening around that. So you can learn about language semantics, how the construction or deconstruction of language happens, and how it's converted. You might be aware of an interpreter and a compiler, right? So these are the two things. If you have any language like C, Java, Python, any language you take, it will have an interpreter as well as a compiler. These two are software which are required to deconstruct that language into a machine level language and make it into executable code. So these are some things that you can research upon. And one additional thing that I wanted to suggest for you that you could probably research upon is dynamic voltage scaling. And this is a key technique which is used today in exploring the hardware characteristics of processors. And this technique helps you in reducing your energy dissipation by lowering the voltage that is supplied to it and operating the frequency based on the circumstances. So if you take phones or mobile devices, right, and you have a lot of processes that are running on a mobile device operating system, you could be running an app, or you could be probably talking on calls, or you could be taking video calls, or you could be in the background, there could be a lot of processes that are running. When you have these multiple threads that are running on any device, how is the energy or how is the resources on that particular device saved? This is actually a concept which is being used by Samsung now, dynamic voltage scaling. So Samsung is using this to reduce the heat that is dissipated from its system. This is something that you can research on, and it is a very interesting topic for you to probably study more about, and a more efficient usage of resources. And the sixth category that we have, subcategory that we have, is mobile applications. I'm sure a lot of you have used any application, or you might have used a messaging application like WhatsApp, or maybe a call application, or you could have used a game, or you might have played a game, or you could have used something like Swiggy, Dunzo, you could have used Uber, Ola for transportation. A lot of applications have practical implications today. So a lot of our daily tasks have become easier because of a mobile application. And any software that you develop over the web, any software that you develop standalone, can easily be, you can get a wider user base if you have it developed as an application. So when you're developing an application, so it's basically for use on any small wireless computing device. So you can, when you are making an application, you need to think about what is my user base for that? Who are the users who are going to consume it? And based on that, you can develop the type of the application that you want. If you take categories of applications, you have native apps, which is basically created only for one specific platform or an operating system. You have web apps, which is nothing but it's a responsive version of a website, right? And it can work on any mobile device or any operating system, and it is independent of where you're running it. And you have something called as a hybrid app, which is a combination of both native and web, and it is wrapped within a native app, and it has its own ability and can be deployed on any device, can be downloaded on any device from an app store. So these are the kind of different application types that we have in mobile applications. So when you're developing a mobile application, you need to keep in mind a few key features that are required. So if you take about the features that are important when you're developing a mobile application, so the first and foremost important thing is your usability. Is it achieving the task that the application is supposed to be doing? So functionality is the most important thing. So if I take an application for registration of voters. So I have an application for registration of voters in India. So am I able to register successfully for my area, to vote in my area? Is the functionality of that app. So usability, how easy it is for the user to use. Portability, can I execute it on any app? Can I use it on my Android device? Can I use it on an iOS device? So how portable is it? And how easy is it for the customer to use are some of the things that you need to keep in mind. And simplicity and speed plays a very important role when you are doing an application, because if you have too many options on your screen, or you have too many icons, or it's too slow for the loading time is too high, or the performance is very low, so you might not be able to attract a lot of users for your application. So simplicity and speed is very important. A lot of applications today have integration with social and payment gateways, social accounts and payment gateways. So if you take, for example, WhatsApp, so WhatsApp also has a payment option now, right? If you talk about social account, the integration, it's basically you're saying that you need not register on the app with all your details. You can just pull all the data from any social account. Like if your mobile device already has a Google account, or it has an iCloud account, so you can register, you can skip the registration process on the app, and directly all the details are taken from that Google account or iCloud account. So social integration in an app, it really helps people when they are starting to use it. And payment gateway, of course, you can have wallets within the application. E-wallets are a very common, it's commonly used today. You have Paytm, you have MobiKwik, you have Recharge, and you have a lot of applications which are e-wallets and which are used for purchasing even on e-commerce websites. And of course, one of the most important feature to have in an application is security, because you have usability, you have simplicity, you have social and payment gateway integration, but you don't have data security, and you don't have network security, or anybody is able to access the details on your app, then nobody is going to use it. So one of the most important features that you need to think about when you're implementing an application is how secure is the data, and how can I make sure that the information that the user is giving in the application is encrypted or it is secured. There is another aspect to it, which is privacy consent. So for example, if an application asks details from the user like age or date of birth, or these are all considered personally identifiable information. So this is a global standard called as PII. So PII data means it can uniquely identify an individual. So it contains details like the name, it could be the date of birth, it could be the age, it could also denote a bank account number. So these are personally identifiable information which uniquely social security number, right? So these are things which can uniquely identify a person. And it's important that when you're collecting such information through an application, you make sure that you get consent from them, get consent from the user, that this is the information that we are collecting, but we're not storing it on our app. We're only using it to, ensure that you are a valid or you're a legitimate user. So when you are taking information from the user, you need to tell them that what is the purpose for you to collect that information? Why are you collecting that data, and where are you going to use it? For how much time are you going to use that data? Are you going to be using it in any analytics? Are you going to be storing it on your server, or is it? Are you not going to be storing it? So these are some things that you need to clearly state in your application, and you need to get consent from the user. So you may think that nobody reads that checkbox saying terms and conditions, and that nobody will read, but it's very important to keep these things in mind when you're developing an application. And this is a good to have feature, which is the last one, is customization. So customization is basically your layout, your design, your template, icons. If you want to have a widget, you don't want to have a widget, or you want to have specific color themes, or you want to have specific backgrounds that you want to change for your application. So these are things that a user might want to customize and it's a good thing to have. So somebody might be more comfortable with brighter themes, so somebody might be more comfortable with a larger font. So you can make these things customizable in your application. And some research topics in this area are like we discussed earlier. You can have a gaming app that runs on VR, which is virtual reality or augmented reality. You can have applications which are integrated with barcode scanner or image recognition for a unique identification, right? So if you talk about the applications that we use today, we have self-driven transport available to us. So if you take Ola, today you can have a car delivered to you and you can use that car for your own transport. You can drive it around for the next 2 to 3 days and then you can return it. Even if you don't own a car, you have a car for you for 2 to 3 days for you to be able to use that. And for Ola as an application to be able to achieve that, they will take some kind of authentication from you to ensure that you are the intended user of that service. So it could be a barcode scanner, or it could be where both the user and the person delivering that both have to ensure that it is matching. And it could also be something like an image recognition. So if you are the person entering the car, it knows that, okay, you are using it, and that is saved in their database for future record. And these are some things that can be integrated in an application and which have a lot of practical usage in today's world. And an application can also be integrated with HMI. So like I said earlier, smart home systems. So you leave the house and after traveling half the way to your office, you suddenly wonder whether the geyser is switched off or whether the fan is switched off or whether the lights are switched off. So if you have a smart home system, you will have an HMI, you will have an app which is integrated with that. And you can say you can just switch off all the lights in all rooms. So you can be rest assured that even if something was on with the use of that app, everything will be switched off. So these are some things where smart home systems come into play. And of course, applications today have a lot of meaning because we have real-time analytics happening. We have real-time tracking of data happening, not just tracking. So like I said, data analytics is not just for getting information and just putting it aside, just generating patterns and putting it aside. So it is for you to take an informed decision on it. So for example, if you have an ambulance tracking application, so in my area, within 1 kilometer, how many ambulances are available? How many are readily available if there's a medical emergency? How many can immediately come and provide assistance? How many of them have medical personnel along with them in the ambulance? How many of them have, say, a ventilator within the ambulance? So how far is the nearest hospital that the ambulance can take the patient to? So these are all things that an application can do. It can not only assign a patient with an ambulance service, it can also tell them how much time, how far away it is, how much time it's going to take for medical help to reach them. So these are very important in today's world for us for practical purposes. So there was a project done last year on eSwachh Bharat, which is an online waste disposal, which is in waste management, where they had done everything from like they have an automated dustbin where if it is above a particular level, it automatically gets closed, and using interface or using an app, you can track how many dustbins are there in your area which are already full, and the municipality can then come and pick up or empty those bins and allocate resources accordingly. So you can optimize instead of having a fixed routine of the municipal workers going through all the points daily, they can reach that location only when the bin is full. So this way you're optimizing your resources. So real-time tracking and resource allocation, a lot of these things can be achieved through apps. And you might be aware of Arogya Setu, which is a government app where you can, track how many people around you today are possibly facing COVID symptoms. How many people have tested on the app saying that, they have these possible symptoms, and how many have actually tested positive. That data is also shown. And there is information available on the app of what are the nearest available medical centers, medical testing centers, or hospitals which have doctors and beds and ventilators available. So these are all the information that an application can provide, which is of very, very immense practical value, especially in today's time. And these are some possible areas that you can think about. You can come up with a practical problem, take a simple problem, take transport, take, medical care, take any, like day-to-day activity like a smart home system, and you can develop an app based on that. So these are some topics that I had, which you can probably research on for mobile applications. And our last topic for today, it's very ironical that we are discussing this today because it is online learning, and it is about e-learning systems. So how can we move away from the traditional means of education? So earlier, if you would probably say 10 years back, only person going to a classroom, only people who have access to schools, only people who are enrolled in schools were able to receive education, or were able to learn something. If you even want to learn a hobby, like you want to have a hobby like fitness, or you want to learn music. So only if you are having access to the physical resources were you able to learn something. But today it's a very different scenario. You could be learning from someone halfway across the globe. You could be learning music from someone halfway across the globe. Or your fitness instructor could be in a totally different part of the country, but they could be training you. They could be monitoring your nutrition. Or you can even gain access to a lot of materials available online for you to learn something about. So today it's very important for us to move towards a more non-conventional methods of learning, and how we can build more better systems, more interactive systems, for us to better achieve that, to better achieve online learning. And this is what this category or this subcategory is all about. And since a lot of you are already doing it, I think you all might be experts in this already. So utilizing electronic technologies to access educational curriculum outside of a traditional means. So it is not only exploring the design of learning activities and programming, but it is also for effective usage of it. So for example, I could be slow in understanding a particular topic, but if that particular lecture by that professor is recorded, I can go over it 2 to 3 times. The parts that I did not understand the first time, I might need to listen to it 2 to 3 times. I can record and rerun it for me to be able to understand it better. So I could not probably do this 5 or 8 years back, because most of them, we did not have recorded lectures. So if you wanted to understand something or you missed something, you had to look for other sources of information for you to learn that. So today we have these available resources which can help a lot of people pace their education. So if one of the disadvantages of our education system is that they expect all of you to learn at the same pace, all of us to learn at the same pace, which is not fair, because each of us have a different grasping capacity, each of us have different interests, each of us have different comprehensive abilities. So each person has their own learning curve. And it's not just in schools, it's also in environments, in industries, in corporates. So each one has a different learning curve. And with online learning, with e-learning systems, that gap or that bridge is very effectively reduced, because you can adjust it as per your pace. You can adjust it as per your requirement, as per your interest. What you're interested in, you can learn more, you can spend more time on that. And if you are interested in a particular topic that you do not have physical access to resources, and somebody in some other part of the country is able to teach you online, so that is something which is great, and which we should be able to do so in the future. And one other thing that I wanted to highlight is, which I've already mentioned, is it's not just for students, for the intended audience of online learning. It's not just, a school curriculum or school students. Today we have in industries, people are being onboarded into their jobs, into their job profiles completely virtually. So there are people who have been, joining jobs just by sitting at home. So they have been sent a desk to home. They have been sent, all the software installed in the laptops. They've been asked to start work online. So there are training programs which are being done online. And somebody who's even working in a manufacturing plant today is able to get trained on it online. And it's not just for students, but it's beneficial for people of all ages, across industries, corporates. And it's not only for a professional benefit, it's also for a personal benefit, right? So if you have a passion like fitness or music, or you want to learn a new language, which you earlier could not learn because you did not have access to that physical source of learning. And today that gaps are bridged and those problems are solved today with this new technique of learning. There's a lot of advantages that come along with an online learning system. There are a lot of disadvantages as well, but the positives outweigh the negatives as far as I can understand. And some of the positives that I see is convenience and flexibility, right? So if you are not available for a particular lecture or a session that is happening, say during the night time, you can always, attend that at a flexible time. You can, you can listen to the recording the next day morning. You can listen to it whenever you are available, whenever you have free time. It's also a mention of convenience. So if you have to go to a physical class, you have to think about transport. You have to think, how am I going to go there, or who is going to, or if you're a student, who is going to drop me to that place. So these are the things. So convenience is a major factor in learning, because a lot of people, drop out of learning something new just for the sake of convenience, even though they are interested in it. So convenience and flexibility are it's a major advantage for e-learning systems. Accessibility, and like I mentioned earlier, you can adjust your pace of learning. Audio and visual aids definitely help in grasping the concepts better than a conventional blackboard or whiteboard method of instruction. And I'd like to give a shout out to all the teachers or all the mentors there who are doing a commendable job today in, adapting so quickly. And during the pandemic time, a lot of you are doing an incredible job in, keeping the curriculum going, ensuring that the students are not impacted. So really hats off to you. And another advantage which I could, think about with e-learning systems is that somebody with different needs, somebody with special needs can get a lot of benefit out of this online learning, because you can introduce speech therapy, you can introduce assisted voice you can introduce voice assistants, you can, include interactive, you can have interactive modules where somebody is able to, interact with the particular application or the software, and they're able to learn from it. So this is something which was not available to a lot of people with different needs. We had a blanket education, we had a blanket system available for people with all kinds of needs. But this is a very big boon for people with different needs. You can have, visual aids, you can have speech therapy, you can have music therapy, you can have any kind of other aids that people with different needs require can be developed as software, and it's a big boon for those students or for those people. And this is a major advantage that I see in this. So these are the categories or subcategories in software systems that I had prepared for discussion today. So my major intent was to get you familiarized with the categories and subcategories. It was to, a lot of you might be already aware of some of them, a lot of you might not be aware of them, but my intent was to, get you familiarized with the term, what is happening in today's world in these categories, what is happening in the industries in today's world, how it can be, worked upon to improve it better, what are the advantages of some of the concepts in these categories. So that is what I wanted to discuss today, and hope you got the benefit of that. I'll just be quickly walking you through the process of developing a project in Iris. If you're interested in any of these subcategories, or you have decided that you're interested in a particular topic and you want to research more on that, and you want to develop a project for IRIS for that. So what are the steps that you need to follow? And the first step is obviously you have to have a clear problem statement and a defined purpose. So what is the problem that you're trying to solve? Are you trying to solve a problem of availability of medical care? Are you trying to solve a problem of, not having sufficient data to make an informed choice? Are you trying to solve a problem of security? Are you trying to solve a problem of ease of access to transport? So what is the problem that you're trying to solve? You need to have a very clear problem statement, and based on that, you can then spend time in extensive research on that topic, on your topic of interest. You can think about possible solutions. You can think about different ways of implementing a solution for that problem. And once you think about how you're going to go about implementing a solution, right? How you're going to solve that problem. You might have multiple, you might have a lot of sources available. You might have a lot of information available. Again, you have to mine it. You have to find something meaningful out of all the access to information that you have. So you need to perform your own experiments. You need to perform your own analysis. So you need to find relevant data sources relevant to your area of subject. You need to maintain logs, observations, daily records of what is it that you observed today, or a single lead that you got today, which will help you tomorrow if you go back. So that really helps, maintaining a daily log and making sure that, you're on the right path. You have, these are the different solutions that you thought of, and you picked up a particular way of a solution to implement it. And these are the observations I had while I was implementing it. It could be a failure, and that's perfectly okay. You say you have 3 possible solutions for a problem. You tried solution A and you did a log for say 10 days, and solution A was a failure. You could not solve the problem through solution A, but you thought that it could solve. So then you can move on to solution B, try for plan B. Your logs will help you understand why you failed. It's important to fail. It's important to learn from failures and not just always succeed, right? Only when you fail, what is it that you shouldn't do. So with that logs, with that data, that'll help you learn, and you can probably come up with a better solution. You can optimize it over time. So this is one of the major advantages of IRIS. It not only helps you, bring a systematic process into your thinking, it also helps you in problem solving. So tomorrow it could help you if you have a problem, both a professional or a personal life. So this kind of a systematic thinking, or this kind of a logical thinking, it brings a lot of discipline into your other areas of life. And the last thing, which is the most important thing, is bringing novelty into your project, right? So we cannot just take credit for somebody else's hard-earned work, or we cannot just modify something that is already available, that is already patented, or which is already published, and we cannot just modify it a little and take credit for that. So we'll have to innovate it. We'll have to make it unique. And IRIS has this as a very important criteria in its evaluation. So each project, when it is evaluated in initial stages, so is it so that it goes through all the there's a whole evaluation done about, is it an existing, what are the existing projects that are there in that particular topic, and what are the observations that have been done in this particular project that are different from what are already available, what are the different methods used, and what is the solution, what is the innovation in the solution that you have implemented to make it unique. So these are some of the things that I wanted to share with you, and in the timeline of developing a project, and some things that you can probably keep in mind when you're developing a project. And there are, whenever you're doing something, when you're researching a project, or you are trying to implement a solution, it's very, very important to do it the right way. It's very important to take into consideration what are the ethical issues that may arise. So I wanted to share with you ethical considerations before you take up a project. So first and foremost, the most important thing is informed consent. All right, so we already discussed this in multiple categories today, which is data privacy and confidentiality needs to be kept in mind. If you're taking something some data from a user. For example, you are using images of a particular disease, so somebody had done a project last year about, detecting skin cancer based on a data model that analyzes all previous images of various types of cancer. So if you give a particular image based on the previous images, it can tell you what could be the possible, first of all, whether that image does it denote a particular kind of skin cancer, and if it does, what is the type of skin cancer that the image denotes. So these are the data. This data modeling is done on an input of images that have been collected from various reliable sources. And it's very important to keep the owners of those images informed that you are using this data for your project and that you're using it for this particular purpose. And it's very important to take their consent and keep them informed that your data is secure and that this is the only purpose for which I'm using your data. So informed consent is very important. And the second thing is citations and references. So you might be, when you're doing your research, your first step or your second step, which is trying to study more about that particular subcategory, trying to understand it more, you might go through a lot of published papers, you might go through books, you might go through websites. So it's very important to make a note of all of those reference sources from where you are getting possible ideas for your solutions, or from where you are taking information. So citations and references definitely need to be kept in mind when you are submitting a project. And the third important thing is reliability and viability. So when you're collecting data, it needs to be from a reliable source. Like I said, it has to be a valid input. So if I take, for example, I'm collecting data on different types of crops. So it has to be something for an agricultural research purpose. So it has to be relevant to that particular area of study. And not just that, it has to be relevant to the time of the study. So if you're referring to data that is probably 2 or 3 years old, or you're referring to a study that is 2 or 3 years old, is it still valid in today's time? Are those results still valid today? Are those conclusions still valid today? So these are some things that you need to think about when you're picking up a project. It could be relevant, it could not be relevant, but it is for you to make that decision. It is for you to do research on that and find out that whether that information is still relevant. Is it relevant to my study? Is it something that I can use as a reliable source for my project? And the last thing that you can keep in mind when you're doing a project is avoid duplicity or plagiarism. So, intellectual property or IP, they have, it is as important as, securing any other property. So you need to be very careful that you're not, trying to plagiarize somebody else's hard work or trying to duplicate their work. And this is a very important thing that you need to keep in mind. So that is all I had from my side. So over to you, Ishita.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for so patiently walking us through this very informative PPT. We will now have a short video played by Shrey on IRIS before we head for the question answers. In the meantime, all participants are requested to write any questions they may have in the chat box. Shrey, can we have the AV, please?
Are you ready for the ride of your life? Well, it all begins right here. Your first step is picking a category you can enter by yourself or with a partner. If you are in 5th to 8th standard, you will be in junior category. If you are in 9th to 12th, you are in senior category and have a chance of making it all the way to ICEF. Now that you know which category you are in, it is time to find out which subject your project comes under.
At IRIS, you have a variety of 21 subject categories to choose from, ensuring that your project has a category that fits. The categories include animal sciences, behavioral and social sciences, biochemistry, biomedical and health sciences, biomedical engineering, cellular and molecular biology, chemistry, computational biology and bioinformatics, earth and environmental sciences, embedded systems, energy, sustainable materials and design, engineering mechanics, environmental engineering, material sciences, mathematics, microbiology, physics and astronomy, plant sciences, robotics and intelligent machines, system software, and transitional medical sciences.
A display shows the public and the judges what you have done. You're looking to attract and inform visitors about your project. To make it easy for people to access your results by creating a clear, attractive and concise display. The focus should be the work. Take a look at this reference. Your title should be simple and must accurately represent your research. Take photographs or videos of important parts or phases of your experiment to use in your display. Prepare a miniature of your model in case your prototype is too large to be carried along. Make sure your display is logically presented and easy to read. Use neat, colorful headings, charts, and graphs to present your project. Pay special attention to labeling. Be sure to adhere to the size limitations and safety rules when preparing your display.
The IRIS journey begins with registration on the website www.irisnationalfair.org with submission of online synopsis and supporting documents. These entries are prejudged by the IRIS Scientific Review Committee, and shortlisted projects are sent an email inviting them to participate in the IRIS National Science Fair. Winners of the IRIS National Science Fair qualify for an intensive series of mentoring camps and get the opportunity to represent India at platforms such as the Regeneron International Science and Engineering Fair in the United States of America. ICEF is the world's largest pre-college STEM competition. Over 265 Indian students have won over 160 awards at this competition, competing with over 6 million high school students from all over the world each year. Not only are you getting a chance to make your nation proud, but if you're lucky, you could join the 31 Indian students who have had minor planets named after them.
So guys, please don't miss this opportunity.
It's your turn now.
If you're innovative and you really want to bring about a change in the world, I think IRIS is the right place for you.
If you enjoy science and math and computer science and so on, so I mean, it gives you a platform to show what you've done, and you have a chance to go to ISEF too.
If science actually kindles your curiosity and you're really passionate about it, IRIS provides you the largest platform in India to show your talent.
Applying to IRIS, not only get to have a great experience, you meet great people and great mentors at that. They're not judges, they're not judging you, they're mentoring you, they're teaching you. They make you learn new things.
In the end, it's not about winning or losing, it's about experience, and IRIS National Fair guarantees great experience. Don't tell people what your dreams are, show what your dreams are through IRIS.
It's once in a lifetime experience.
It's your turn.
It's your turn, it's your turn.
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 We now open for questions, and we have the first question coming to us on email, ma'am. This is from a very concerned parent who asks that due to this lockdown situation, they have had to get a laptop for their son. And since the son is an avid gamer, he likes to download games and use this laptop to access these games. The question is that he downloads games from pirated websites, and how does that affect the laptop system, and what impact can it have?
Okay. I think this is a very common concern, that many parents may have. So if you're using any laptop for downloading anything on the internet or downloading any pirated versions, obviously it's not safe for the laptop, or you could inadvertently, download. It could include viruses, or it could include any malicious software that could, try to ruin your computer's operating system, or it could try to slow down its processing. So that is something that you can keep note of. I would suggest gaming is not bad. So definitely gaming is a very huge industry. And, if it is in a controlled, if you can play games, or if you can utilize applications for gaming and try to learn more about it, obviously the student has interest in that area. So they can probably find more reliable sources for gaming. They can find, more proper websites or proper versions of those games from where there are a lot of free online available games that they can probably use it for. So that is what I would say.
We have a few more questions that have come in on the chat. There's one from Inesh Tiku. He asks, does the UI/UX design have a good impact on scoring in the HMI category?
Yes, so definitely. That's a very good question, because in a human machine interface, what we're essentially trying to do is trying to improve the user experience, trying to give them a better representation of data visually. So if you take like any interface, for example, you take a smartwatch. So if you do not have a good UX, the whole functionality falls apart. The whole purpose of that of having such a device falls apart. So you definitely need to have a good UI, or you need to have a wholesome UX for that particular project that you're working on. But it's not just about that, right? You're trying to, the first step when you're doing a project is trying to find a problem statement. So what is the problem that you're trying to solve? If I just have good UI, I just have good UX, but it is not achieving anything. It is not helping me control any software system. It's not helping me provide, informative patterns. It's not helping me trying to make an informed decision based on the input that I get through the HMI. So then even having a good UI or a good UX would not help the overall purpose of the research project.
The next question, ma'am, is from Miss Anu. She wants to know about any open source platform where she can teach their kids for doing data analysis or any beginner level projects.
Yes, so definitely there are a lot of open source platforms available. A quick Google search will lead you to a lot of different available platforms, and I think one of them is Hadoop. Hadoop is an open source platform where you can do a lot of data analytics. You can input data and you can try and get some patterns, and you can try and get some analytics out of it. So a lot of open source tools are available, and I'm really happy that you asked this question, because it shows that you're interested in trying to teach your kids around this subject. So I wish you luck.
The next question comes in from Chirag Bhansali, who asks, how does a mobile app qualify for a research event?
Very, very good question, Chirag. So I think, like I mentioned, it is not a standalone mobile application. It is a problem that you are trying to solve. It could a mobile application is not just, a standalone project that somebody is working on, or they are just using an open source platform available to develop an application. They are solving a real time problem, and they are trying to add their own ideas into it. So like, as I mentioned, somebody last year had done a project on self-corrective driving based on the historical driving information of speeding or overspeeding. So the application that is installed probably even in the car dashboard, that could help somebody's life. It could help save somebody's life, because you're trying, it's not just an application that you are using for, viewing the data, or you want to use it to get some information. It's actually controlling the speed of, or it's actually being used to control another software system, and you're able to reduce the speed of that particular vehicle, and you're able to save a life. So in such kind of, and we do know that a lot of students are interested in developing applications. We do know that a lot of students have interest in developing applications, and if it is, so I would suggest, Chirag, is that you think of it as a broader category where you're trying to solve a problem, and through a mobile application, and it is not a standalone mobile application, but it is your whole idea of trying to solve a practical problem is being implemented through the mobile application. So another project that I wanted to highlight is somebody had developed an entire online voting system, a complete online voting system. And in that, they had used so many concepts. So even this e-waste disposal, which is the e-Swachh Bharat waste disposal bin. So they had not only come up with the analytics, like I said, of how many bins are, full for, they had tried to optimize it. They had used data analytics to come up with, to save resources, but they had also come up with an application which helps probably somebody sitting at the municipality office to quickly know, okay, this is my area, and I know that there are 10 bins in my area, and out of 10, 5 of them need immediate attention. So an application is only a means of solving a larger problem. It is a way of solving a larger problem, and it definitely qualifies to be a part of a research event. That is my answer.
The next question is a question that's redirected to the IRIS team. Chirag asks again, what all do we have to submit for the first round in a system software project?
Basically, in the system software project also, like in other projects, you would need to submit a project synopsis. It's there for every project. You would definitely need to submit 250 to 300 word synopsis.
The next one, I think, is a follow-up question to that, but it's from Kautilya P. Can you give some examples of hypotheses that one can use for apps?
Okay. So hi, Kautilya. So hypothesis, again, like I said, is, and so basically what you're doing in a hypothesis is you're trying to come up with a possible solution. So you make a statement saying, this is a problem and this is a possible solution to solve this problem. That is what you do in a hypothesis. And maybe following this particular way would solve my problem. This is what a hypothesis contains of, right? So if you think of a mobile application, again, it depends on your problem statement. So let me go back to my previous stated examples of, say the online waste disposal system. So if you can, if you think the hypothesis for that, it is basically trying to come up with a system that has access, that is able to have sensors installed to measure the level of the particular bins. It is being able to have, have a HMI to be able to display that information to all the possible required users. And it's important not only to have that information, but also to be able to do analytics on that. So in the last 5 days, in the last 1 month, how many times did this get frequently say emptied, or how many days did it get frequently built. So based on that, you can take future decisions. So that is something that you can think about. And when you have a clear problem statement, your abstract, your hypothesis, your possible solutions, all of these statements will become very clear.
The next question, ma'am, is from Dr. Yoganandra Kumar Kothari, who asks, can we use website for citation if there is no any issue of copyright?
Yes, definitely you can use website as a citation.
Even though there is no issue of copyright?
Correct, yes.
The next question comes in from Kautilya P, who asks, can we use apps as a tool to solve problems in other fields such as agriculture? Due to lockdown, experimenting with the app would be a difficult thing to do. Does IRIS take that into consideration?
We use apps as a tool to solve problems in other fields. Okay, due to lockdown, experimenting with the app.
So I think I'll answer this one. Yes, IRIS will definitely take the current situation into consideration. However, at the end of the day, when you put in your synopsis or when you submit your synopsis, you will definitely have some sort of a hypothesis. We are not asking you to complete your project and submit your synopsis. It could be an ongoing project, and you could say that this is what you're exploring. So I think, Sasha, the second part of the question is what ma'am can address of the same student.
Yes, sure. So the second part of the question is how can we use AI in predictive modeling? So that's a very interesting question because artificial intelligence is also one of the categories. I think it comes in a computer science category in our IRIS. So you can obviously use more than one subcategory when you're picking up a project. So if you're using artificial intelligence, it is very closely related with predictive modeling, because in predictive modeling, what is happening is you have past data and you're trying to predict the future based on that past data. And in terms of doing this prediction, what is important is that the model learns by itself. It trains itself if there is a false positive, or if there is something that, if there is a false positive, for example, if there is a transaction that was a genuine transaction, but the model predicted it to be a possible fraud. So this is a learning for the model, and it trains itself over time. And this is a very interesting thing, because if you are able to integrate this with say any component of artificial intelligence that can provide a better output out of this whole predictive modeling thing, because you're trying to add intelligence again to this process by saying, can I get a better output out of this? Can I maybe predict it better? Can I get a better accuracy? So that would be great if you could do that.
The next two questions are also from Kautilya, who asks, how can we use AI in predictive modeling? And may I know what supporting documents are required for submission specific to this category?
Yeah, so I just answered the AI question, and I'll take the next question, which is what are the supporting documents required if you're submitting a project in this category? Did I get the question right? Yeah, okay. If you're going for supportive documents, so the first thing is any of your own analysis, any of your experiments that you've done on your own. So any initial stages of, so for example, if you're doing a HMI, right? If you're doing, you're trying to design a new user interface. So what were the initial designs that you had? You could submit those documents. And if you have any published papers that you actually went through to come up with a new design, or you referred, or you went through a particular paper, so you can add that as a supporting document. And if you have gone through, if you have designed something new and you have done some tests on that, or you have a series of test results that are available, and based on that you have improved, so you can give all that submissions as supportive documents, because it shows your journey. It shows that you started at point A and then you achieved something, and then you improved it over time, you added more innovation. So these are all documents that you can submit to show that you have to show your journey, to show that you have been able to come to this stage by crossing all these all the previous stages.
Participants, if there are any more questions. Thank you, ma'am. I think the participants don't have any more questions. They've already.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Ms. Sharon, we will now hand over to you.
Yes, I just want to thank you so much, Vinita, for being a part of this, taking so much time out of to patiently address all queries and to discuss this topic so thoroughly with everybody who's attended this webinar. I also want to put on record our thanks to Broadcom for being part of IRIS. And Vinita, being from Broadcom, thank you so much for being part of this and for assisting us with this very important new topic which has been incorporated in IRIS for the first time this year. We wish all the participants a lot of luck, and we hope that you have taken note of exactly what Vinita has been sharing this afternoon. For any of your friends who may have missed this webinar, the recording will be available on the IRIS National Fair website. So please feel free to go